Hello, everyone. My name is David Ruck. I'm at the University of Maryland in Baltimore, Maryland, and welcome to Cytometry in R. This is a testing of our Livestream system, looking specifically at some of the pre-course materials, specifically the workstation setup, looking at how to install software specifically on macOS systems. The Livestream audio has been giving us a couple bit of issues, but the last video seemed to work a little bit better. I apologize in advance if this turns out to be horrible audio. This is why we're live stream testing now, so that when it comes to the actual course material, we won't have static noise everywhere. So, Cytometry in R, for those of you who are aware, is a free weekly mini course covering a lot of the different materials. It's meant for beginners in coding, but who have some flow cytometry experience in the past. So, based on our initial interest form, about 30% of the class is on macOS as far as their operating system. Now, I didn't ask the question at the time, which is something I should have asked, is how many of you are using older MacBooks which are using the Intel chips, and how many of you are on the newer ARM-based M1 Plus series chips. But overall, there's a good amount of you, so I'm making sure everybody's operating system is covered as far as the installation instructions. In the context of a macOS system, the software that you actually need to install is obviously R, which is our programming language that we'll be using throughout the course. Positron, which is our integrated development environment, or IDE, which is what we're going to be used to open, modify, and run our code base. And then also we'll need to install Git. Now, depending on what version of macOS you're using, you may already have Git available in the system. The reason for this is it's packaged together with the Xcode command line tools, which oftentimes, if you've been tinkering around with either RStudio or Positron or VS Code, you'll end up having a pop-up which gets selected and you already have it on your system. Unlike Windows, where you would also need to install our tools, this Xcode command line tools is also what's already able to do all the compilation of packages from source to binary. So there's only 3 pieces of software we'll need to do for the installation for the macOS. So let's go ahead and get started. When you're going to start off by first, let's go ahead and install R. And to do so, we need to navigate to the R website, which is included in the links on the website. Also, if you are just watching the live stream and haven't seen the Cytometry in R website yet, the link is in the text below. So once you ending up on R's webpage, what we're doing is we're trying to find this download R link that's buried here, just at the very top of the page. And as we follow through, it's going to land on this asking about mirrors page. So a mirror is basically if there's a university or other institution that wants to share server space to make it a little bit easier to distribute the software, this is what's called a mirror. It was particularly important back in the early days of the internet. It's a little bit less relevant right now, but basically what you're trying to do is select the closest location so that you're able to download it with relatively a little bit of lag. If you don't want to select a particular location, it's perfectly fine to select the cloud option, and then it will figure out and do some of the routing for you. So don't sweat this page. It's not as much effort as it seems. So on the next page, this is the where it actually does matter. So seeing as you're working for macOS, you want to select the macOS option right up here at the top. If you are watching this video and are actually using either Windows or Linux, you have your own pre-course walkthrough that's specific to your operating system. So please check the website and go to the correct location. Don't try to follow the instructions for macOS. We have put the effort to make sure everybody's operating system is covered. Next up, you need to select this correct appropriate architecture as far as what your computer is running. So this is a little bit of context. The newer Macs, anything with the M+1 chip, is using an ARM64 option, which you'll see on the page. But then all the older Intels, basically everything pre-2020, will be the x86_64 option. So if you don't actually know where this is to figure out on your particular Mac, if you go up in the upper left side of your Mac and check About This Mac tab, it should tell you what kind of chip it's being used. This is a hyperlink if you're checking the website, so you would be able to see exactly how to do it. So when you're selecting these options, it's these two options right here at the center of the screen. If you have a M1 Plus series Mac that's using the ARM silicon, you just go select that installer. If you're using the Intel-based chips, you'd select the option below. At this point, you're going to download the installer, and then you launch it just like you do for any other program you're trying to install on a Mac. You're going to get this kind of generic installer screen, and you're going to proceed with all the different options. Gives you the warning, of course, of like, hey, here's a specific version. If you're using a newer Mac, go with the other installer. My Mac is a 2020 Intel chip Mac, which is where the screenshots were taken with. It will then ask you to go ahead through the rest of the installation process. There's a bunch of information about what's being installed. It will ask you to agree to the license, which is a GPL2 license. We'll cover the differences between copyright and copyleft licenses later on in the course. A lot of our packages tend to be GPL2 or GPL version 3, but don't sweat it for now. It's available for everybody. As you then proceed through several different pages of where I normally will go and select the default option. So go ahead and proceed with those, and then click on Install. At that point, what you're going to do is you should go find a coffee or tea or your hot beverage of choice. It might take a few minutes. And then with any luck, by the time you get back, you should see the installation was successful page, which is what you're looking for. All right, at this point, you have one of the pieces of software that we need to install done, and we should be able to move on and actually acquire the next piece. This one, we're going to go ahead and tackle what's the RTools equivalent for Windows. Basically, that Xcode command line tools, which will be both Git and the RTools equivalents for macOS. So this one is a little bit more complicated, especially for somebody who's just starting off with coding, hasn't touched a terminal. Basically, you will need to go into your terminal on your macOS to be able to bring it in and activate it on your system. The reason why I'm saying you may need to do this is if you have done any coding before in Positron, RStudio, or Visual Studio Code, you may have encountered a pop-up like this already, clicked install, and it may already be present on your system. So it's one of those things that I'm assuming most of you would have not clicked on it just because you are just starting off. But if you have been coding a while, if you've been tinkering for a while, you may already have these tools present. These command line tools, as I mentioned, are basically both Git and the RTools equivalents, so we do need to install them. So this is where we need to open your terminal. And when you open your terminal, it's going to give you a little command line prompt. And within this, what you're going to do is copy this command. So xcode -select space 2 hyphens in a row and install, basically saying this xcode select package, you want to install it. And then you're going to hit enter. This is a screenshot provided by Jennifer. I appreciate her help getting these screenshots because I had already done this process on my macOS, so I wasn't able to do it for the course. I appreciate all the effort that went in. And it's going to proceed to install, and you're going to get that same pop-up that may have already occurred, and you're going to go ahead and select install. So the only interaction with the terminal you had to do was the xcode -select. You'll next have the same kind of install license because this is also including Apple tools. It's not just Git and it's not just the equivalent. It is owned by Apple, so you have to agree to our license agreement. And then it's going to proceed to install the software, which is what you're hoping to do. And if all works out, you should see the software is now successfully installed. Now, we haven't yet installed Positron, but Positron is going to be the main way we're going to be able to see whether the Xcode command line tools installation was successful. So normally what you do when you first open Positron, you'll see this little tab on the bottom. This will show you basically where the version control features interact with each other. So when you open this tab, what you're going to be able to see is if you see something like this, you know you're pretty much set to go. Alternatively, if you have this little pop-up notice saying Git is not present, then you know your Xcode installation did not quite work, and then you should proceed to troubleshooting. If you run into issues at any point during installation of the software, please remember on our GitHub repository, we have the discussions page please post your issue there, and I or anybody else who has been encountering a similar issue will be more than glad to help you troubleshoot your installation. We can't do the clicking of the mouse for you, but we can give suggestions as far as what your next troubleshooting steps will be. All right, at this point, you would have installed 2 of the required pieces of software. Now it's time to install the last, which is installing Positron. So, Positron is our integrated development environment, IDE, which is where we will be opening, modifying, and running our code. Other examples of IDE are RStudio, which you may be familiar with if you've tinkered with an R in the past, and also Visual Studio Code. The reason we're using Positron for this course is a lot of the things that you had to really search for to find in RStudio are a lot easier to get to. So you can hover over things to get to the help files. All the folder projects that you have are visible from the get-go. You don't have to go searching for different customizations, and setting up GitHub is a lot easier than it is with RStudio, especially with Macs, so it's the main reason for using it. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up the Positron web page, and we're going to go select the free download option. Positron is managed under an Elastic license, which is not an open source license, but it's a source available license, which it will cover during that same section of the course later on. And once you have selected the agree to the licensing agreement, it'll give you the option to download. So the installers that you have are the option for Universal, which would handle both ARM64 as well as x86 Macs. But then there's also the specific versions for x86 or ARM64. So depending on what you're doing, you would select those options accordingly. Once your download completes, please proceed to install the package as you would normally for any other program. The installation instructions are very similar if you wanted to go line by line, but they're pretty close to default is what you should go for all the options. All right, at this point you have installed all the software that you'll need. The next step is connecting your GitHub account with your Positron on your local computer so that you're able to bring in the forked copy of Cytometry in R, as well as any repository projects that you create remotely, being able to bring them into your local system. When we first open Positron, we're going to see this view. We're actually covering Positron more in depth in a little bit for the next walkthrough. For now, this is just going to be a general overview for just the setup with GitHub. What we're going to do first is up in the upper right side is the Start Session tab. This is the interpreter button. Once you click on this, you're going to be able to select which programming language you're going to use. Seeing as we're working in a Cytometry in R course, select the most recent version of R that's available on your computer. R will then proceed to activate, and if your R installation was successful, you should see code appear saying your different version of R that's now present. That's how you know it is now successfully set up on your computer. Next up, you're going to go to the very far left and then to the very far bottom, which you see this little person icon. You're going to go ahead and click on it, and then you're going to see the option to sign in with GitHub to use the GitHub pull request feature. It's often good to go ahead and open your web browser that you use on a regular day basis. Go ahead and sign into your GitHub account just so it's ready to go. It's going to give a pop-up that then asks you to move to GitHub, so if you're already signed in, you can cut out some of the steps. This is what it looks like on my Mac. Basically, it provides you a security code that you can then copy and paste into the GitHub prompt just to set up the connection. I go ahead and hit copy and continue to GitHub. And since I'm already signed in, I just have to select my user profile. And I then proceed to provide the code that was provided to me by Positron. I then go ahead and select Authorize Positron Dev, which then sets up the connection, and we're able to use it within Positron. Something that we've encountered over the last 2 days with the in-person participants, is that sometimes, and we don't know exactly why, on a couple of their computers, instead of showing Authorized Positron, GitHub is getting confused and showing Authorized VS Code. Positron is based off of an earlier version of VS Code, so we're kind of wondering if it's just accidentally confusing the two. However, when we went ahead and authorized, regardless on the screen, considering we just made the request, it is correctly connecting with your Positron account. So for now, just go ahead and authorize and go back to Positron at that stage. And if all this works out, you should see this pop up for GitHub saying that you have set up the connection. at which point we can return to Positron, go back down to that little person icon on the very lower left, and you should be able to see your GitHub account is now showing there, which would mean that your connection is now present. All right, at this point, we have installed all the required software that we need on our Mac. We have now established the connection between our GitHub account that's remote and our Positron software. Now we need to bring those repositories that we created during the last step, specifically our README repository, which is how we control the profile portion of our GitHub account, as well as the forked version of the Cytometry in our project. We need to bring those both locally and into our local computer so that we're able to interact with them during the course. So to do this, we're going to go back up to the upper right, and we're going to hit that little folder icon that we see up there. And then we're going to have two options. New folder from template is if you're starting everything locally, versus new folder from Git is when you're bringing in a project that's already remote. So that's the option we're going to select for today. Now, we should go ahead and open up our browser and go back to our particular GitHub profile page. What we're going to need is the URL for each of the repositories that we're bringing in. So in the context of the course's GitHub account, we have the GitHub username of the profile and then the particular repository that we're interested in. So we would copy this URL and provide it to Positron when establishing the local version. So just go ahead and copy and paste for your README file first. And we will proceed to copy and paste that into the GitHub repository URL. The main important thing is you need to decide where you want to keep all your different R project folders, because you're going to be making quite a few of them throughout the course. All my projects are generally under my documents folder. Now I know friends of mine who would like create a R specific folder within documents and then store all the working project folders underneath there. However you're doing your organization scheme, that's up to you. Just keep it consistent. The main thing I want to caveat in is particularly for people who were using Windows computers and are using OneDrive or Dropbox or other cloud storage devices. Please don't store the code files that you plan to be actively working with on a remote location like a cloud. The reason for that is if it's trying to sync both the local and the remote copy, it's going to lock those files. So if you're trying to edit them in real time, you're going to run into permission issues and it won't let you proceed. So especially as a beginner, you don't want to have to troubleshoot those steps. So I recommend keeping all files that you're working with for coding on your local computer environment, just so there's no issues that you would encounter in that scenario. Since this is your first time using Positron, it wants to know, hey, you're bringing in this file from a remote location, do you trust the authors? So in the context of your project files, the answer is yes, because you have created them. However, if you are like grabbing a repository from just the random internet, it's oftentimes better just to check and be careful. You will need to go back in if you decide to trust it later and authorize it separately. It just keeps it a little bit more restricted, so just in general, be cautious with what you do. And with that, once you have accepted all the conditions and move forward, you should be able to see that your README file is now brought locally. So all those different files that you could see on your GitHub account are now visible. Instead of having to edit it within your actual web browser, which is what we did in the last work through, you can now actually edit it within your console window, within the editor section of Positron, make all those changes, preview those changes. A lot easier to do than what you had to do from the website. You then repeat the course of the process. We have downloaded and brought in locally the README repository. We need to repeat this step with the Cytometry in R forked version that you have under your own GitHub account. Once again, you would copy the URL link and then bring that in locally using the same process of steps we did for the README file, copying and pasted. It looks like we duplicated the slide screenshots for README there. I'll need to make those edits. So, just to conclude, we have now installed our Positron and made sure that you have the Git and command line tools utilities available on your macOS. We've connected with your GitHub account, and we brought both of your repositories that you currently have on that account to your local project folders on your local computer. At this point, you now have all the pieces of software that you would actually need throughout this course. So congratulations. Next actual week of the course content, you'll be installing R packages, which are more self-contained and they're not as broad changes as far as what we need to do. Additional pre-course walkthrough tutorials are now available on the website, in which we delve more into the actual infrastructure we're using for the course, specifically Positron, as well as how to actually leverage that connection we had just set up with the GitHub so that any changes you make to your local repositories are sent back to GitHub so that worst case scenario, if something happens to your computer, you still have that data set available. And with that, there's additional resources, specifically how to install software on a Mac. I like to include several videos just for those of you who don't particularly enjoy reading and prefer more listening to the how to do it and visualize it. There's also a brief tour of Positron as well as a brief tour of Intro to Git for beginners. These are both useful, but we also will revisit these topics later on. I'm hoping the audio didn't get too garbled. I apologize once again if it did. We're still doing the live stream testing out which microphones can be used. Hopefully the internet was stable. And I look forward to seeing you over the next couple of weeks as the course starts up. Thanks once again, and have a good evening.